Chapter 21. Ayianna rubbed her backside. The dirt had finally stopped raining down on them. The forest smell of decay saturated the air and squeezed her lungs. How far had they fallen? A shiver crawled across her scalp and down her spine. She shook her head and tried to brush the debris from her hair and clothes, but it was useless. "Is everyone all right?" Cale asked, as he rummaged through his back and pulled out the orb. "Minus a few minor scrapes and bruises, I'd say we're fine," Vian patted Desmond's shoulder. "Right, my friend?" Desmond frowned as he brushed the dirt from his torn doublet. "The next time you decide to go charging off into uncharted territory, watch your step." Ayianna picked up the sword Eloith had given her and sheathed it. "At least we aren't on the dinner menu anymore." "True enough." Vian adjusted his much smaller knapsack across his back. "Yitakoith taisa," Cale whispered. The orb's light sputtered and then faded. He shoved it back into his bag. Desmond and Vian circled beneath the break in the ceiling. Light sifted through, but couldn't reach the shadowed corners of the pit. Behind Cale, an opening split the wall, and patches of light spilled into what looked like a tunnel or a burrow. What other creatures lived in the forest? Did the cat beast live underground like a mole or a gopher? Ayanna's stomach sank. "Wait! Where's Liam?" "She's a wolf. She can take care of herself," Desmond said. "But the Hamadryads, they might try to eat her." Ayanna swallowed against the rising knot in her throat. "Captain Eloith will take care of her. Come on, let's get out of here." Desmond stepped through the opening and disappeared. "Hey," Vian hesitated. "Shouldn't we wait for the fairies? Couldn't they help us out of here?" Cale ducked back into sight. "I doubt it, given the circumstances." "But," the prince glanced back up at the gaping hole far above them, "shouldn't we discuss this?" "What is there to discuss?" Cale gestured toward the ceiling. "We can't climb out, and we can't wait for the fairies. They are in the middle of a battle with creatures who won't die and won't give up. What if the Hamadryads decide to send someone after us? We need to get out of here before we are completely out of food and water." "Come on, Vian," Desmond gave the prince a little push. "We'd like to get out of this hole today." "I only want to evaluate our circumstances before we charge into some other disaster," Desmond grunted. "Perhaps if you had thought of that before, we wouldn't be in this predicament." "Come on," Cale interrupted. "We're wasting time." He disappeared into the tunnel, and Desmond darted after him. Vian glanced back at Ayianna. She couldn't read his expression. Had concern flickered in his green eyes, or was he feeling guilty? He turned away. Ayianna took a deep breath. She hoped Cale was right. But then, had he ever led them astray? She stepped into the black hole after the others. After an hour of stubbing fingers on protruding rocks and tripping on mossy roots, Ayianna and the others stumbled out of the half-darkness and into a steep chasm. The dirt gave way to stone as layers of shale and sandstone curved upwards and outwards into the bright blue sky above them. A stream trickled along the bottom of the ravine, and a few scraggly bushes dotted the rocky banks. Ayianna knelt at the edge of the cold water and drank deeply. Its metallic taste lingered in her mouth. After refilling her water skin, she reclined against the slab of stone. The sight of the sky above and the odor of fungi-rich soil had a calming effect, and a sense of peace settled in her heart. "How are you doing?" Desmond asked as he sat down next to her. "Fine." She glanced at his soiled clothes and disheveled curls and wondered if she looked just as bad. "How about you?" "I have been better." He rubbed the blonde stubble on his dirt-smeared face. If the Plains people preferred women to cover their heads, then they also preferred men to keep their faces shaven. "I would have dressed differently had I known we'd be crawling around in the dirt." "Wouldn't we all?" Ayianna smiled as she thought of the prince in his many colorful robes and fur blankets. "Well, I can't say I'm not impressed," Desmond said. "You have proven to be a strong, determined young woman. A man might be proud to call a woman like you his wife. Just don't get too comfortable in those masculine clothes. I still want a woman when we finish our business with the Guardians." How could he compliment her in one breath and criticize her in the next? She looked down at her brother's old clothes and boots and was suddenly thankful. Hiking through forests and falling down holes weren't exactly dress-wearing activities. Rest time is over. Kale slung his longbow over his shoulder and started down the chasm. Desmond snorted, as if he knows where he is going. He stood and helped Ayianna to her feet. He slid his arm around her waist and pulled her close. Her heart leapt into her throat. She was all too aware of the strength in his arms and his sour-smelling clothes. She dared a glance at his face, and his blue eyes paralyzed her. Just think, in a few months you will be planning a wedding instead of running for your life. Ayianna nodded, and he released her. She pulled her cloak over her shoulders and stepped away. Relief collided with disappointment in a torrent of conflicted feelings. Vian clasped Desmond on the shoulder and smiled. Right, my friend. Don't forget the etiquette training which Lady Mavi of Sherard has graciously offered. Ayianna managed a smile, but her stomach twisted. She didn't want to think about wedding plans and etiquette training yet. How could she? Grief severed her heart. It would consume her if she let it. Didn't Desmond understand? She would avenge the death of her father and her brother and find her mother. She would make things right. Then she could think about marriage. Besides, didn't her father's death change everything? But the disappointment lingered. Had she really wanted Desmond to kiss her? Desmond winked as he grabbed his pack. Let's not keep the half-breed waiting, shall we? The quicker we're out of here, the quicker we start planning the rest of our lives. He flashed a smile and took off after Kale, with Vian in tow. Ayianna hung back. Half-breed. The word stung. What would he think if he knew her secrets? Could she really marry him under such pretenses? But then he chose her. Surely a man would investigate a woman before committing his life to her. Her father's words returned. Humans regarded their wives differently. What did he mean? As the day wore on, Ayianna noticed with growing trepidation that the chasm was narrowing until the layered walls almost touched, forcing the bruised travelers to turn sideways at times to continue their slow progression. I hope this leads somewhere other than to our deaths, Ayianna mumbled. Shuddering, she pushed her legs to keep moving as she slid sideways along the narrow corridor of the stone. Dread oozed through her bones and clawed at her mind. A childhood memory sprang to her mind's eye. Her brother had locked her in an abandoned cellar, and she had screamed until Mother had found her, hoarse and needing a bath. Those same suffocating feelings gripped Ayianna now, but her mother wasn't here to rescue her this time. A scream pressed against the back of her throat. She closed her eyes and pushed it into her gut. Desmond touched her shoulder and urged her forward. She shook her head. I can't do this. Yes, you can. His voice held conviction and kindness, anchoring her. He gripped her shoulder tighter. Vian and Kale are bigger than you, and they're doing just fine. Ayianna turned her head to him and rested her cheek on the cold stone. Tears stung her eyes as her breath caught in her lungs. I can't. You have to. Desmond wiped a tear away. Now keep moving. She turned around and braced herself against the rock, her fingers trembling. The walls pressed in on her. She closed her eyes and inched sideways along the ravine. Her knee collided with a sharp edge and pain exploded down her leg. She gasped, her knees buckling. Steady there. Desmond's hand was on her shoulder again. Give me your hand. Nausea surged through Ayianna's stomach as he grabbed her hand and leaned close. His presence shoved the fear back. If only he could wrap his arms around her and swallow her whole, banishing the fear and the trembling tormenting her body. Don't think, he whispered. Just keep moving one step at a time. She nodded and moved forward, bumping a stone with her foot. It didn't scrape against another rock, but disappeared, echoing off a cavity. She moaned. Was there a break in the chasm's floor? Desmond squeezed her hand. She concentrated on sliding one foot, then the next in a slow shuffle. The ground crumbled away. Ayianna screamed. She reached out, her arms scraping against the stone as the darkness closed in around her. More rocks fell with her. She hit bottom. She gasped for air and tried to blink the darkness from her eyes. She threw herself at the stone embankment and tried to claw her way up, but she only wrenched loose more pebbles and dirt. She was trapped. Ayianna! Desmond grabbed her and pulled her away from the wall. She collapsed, her lungs burning. Desmond held her, but she struggled and shoved against him. Why weren't his arms enough? She needed more air, the sun, the sky, freedom from the death trap she had fallen into. Suddenly, cool, calloused hands pressed against her head. Dreyo sarin, thasiwo ro toe. A breeze brushed across her face, and peace settled the raging fear within her. Kale stood over her, invoking the elven god. She closed her eyes and inhaled deeply of the dank underground air. O sarin vorin thasada riaida, atsi sarin rosiuno. Out of habit, she repeated the refrain, and an image of her father's face flashed in her mind. A flood of grief strangled her heart. She opened her eyes to get away from the pain, only to see it reflected in Kale's. He stepped back. "What did you say, half-breed?" Desmond lifted his head. "I'll have none of your elven incantations spoken over her." Pebbles shifted and continued to rain down as Kale moved away. She blinked the dust from her eyes and slowly sat up, uncertain whether the balm of peace would soon dissolve or not. "Vian!" Desmond called out. "Here!" Vian broke into a fit of coughs. Rocks clattered and Ayianna held her breath. Was it caving in? "What's going on?" Desmond turned and scanned the shadows. "Was that you, Vian?" "It was me," Kale's voice echoed in the darkness. "There is an opening over here." "Why should we follow you?" Desmond asked. "You seem to be leading us into worse situations as we go." "Do you see any other way out?" "What kind of question is that?" Desmond lifted Ayianna to her feet. "As if anyone could see anything in this darkness." Silence answered him, but Kale's patience had to be wearing thin. Ayianna leaned on Desmond to steady her trembling limbs. Had Desmond heard her? Why had she repeated the refrain? Did she really believe Osarin could help her, or was it only out of habit? "All right there, Ayianna?" Desmond kept one hand on her waist as she tested her footing. "I think so." "Hey, I found an opening over here!" The prince's voice rang out and bounced wildly off the walls of the cavern. Desmond tensed. "Not so loud!" He tightened his grip on her arm and hauled her toward the direction of Vian's voice. Ayianna slid her feet along the ground, feeling for holes or protruding rocks. Fear prickled at the edges of her mind. He was going too fast. But then he stopped. "So nice of you to join me," Kale replied. "This crevice actually widens into a tunnel. A man-made tunnel."